Well, hello once again. Today is Monday, February 3rd, 2020. My name is Matt Fury, and you are listening to The Rough Cut. All right, so good to be back. The first big Rough Cut road trip of the year is over. And despite this lingering cold I brought back with me, I consider it a success overall. The two big events from the trip were the Ace Eddies and, of course, the Sundance Film Festival. What I'd like to do is work backwards and talk about Sundance first, but before I do, I will warn you that I have a lot to talk about here before we get the actual podcast underway, so I completely understand that you don't listen to this show to hear me running my big mouth, so I take no offense if you want to start hammering on that fast forward button until you get to our featured interview. Seriously, I wouldn't blame you at all. I won't even know. Okay, back to Sundance. Maybe you caught last week's episode with Catherine Haight and her film troupe Zero. We talked a little bit about Sundance in that one. I spent my time in Park City with my avid colleagues, Burbank Mike Krulik and the marvelous Megan Ross. And if you want to see all the interviews we did from the festival, you can check out Michael's blog. I will put a link to it in the show notes. And I think we did about, close to 20 interviews while we were out there. We got to see some old friends, but we also got to meet a lot of really cool people for the first time. And who knows, some of them will probably end up on this show down the road. Now, if you've never been to Sundance and you love movies, it should certainly be on your bucket list. That said, it is not the glamour trip that a lot of people think it is. Certainly not if you're there working. And I've been going most of this century, and I can say I've never seen a single film there. There's just no time when you're running around trying to coordinate interviews with people. In fact, despite how fun it might look, and it is fun, don't get me wrong, we're basically outside in the cold for 12 hours at a time. And the days are long, and of course the lines are too. Lines for anything, getting on a bus, getting a table at a restaurant. There's just a ton of people crammed into this one small town all at once. And as you can imagine, that has a lot of negative consequences. So for anyone under the false impression that it's one big party for us, you're way off. And if I'm being completely honest with you, every December I start to second guess whether or not I should go and put up with all that. But in the end we go, and the reward is the people we get to meet. They were all great, and I hope you get a chance to see some of these interviews. So that's Sundance. And as for the Eddies, the Ace Eddies, all right, that is nothing but fun. I can't think of a single negative thing about that. Again, you're meeting amazing people, and you get to squeeze into a tux or a dress and think about all the things you shouldn't have eaten in the past month. But let's focus on the cool people. Tom Eagles from Jojo Rabbit had a big win for Best Film Editing for a Comedy. Jojo Rabbit director Taika Waititi was not only on hand for that, but he also gave a hilarious speech about editors as he was introducing the nominees for Best Film Editing in the Dramatic category. And that award went to our guest on today's episode, editor Jinmo Yang from Parasite. Parasite, if you haven't seen it, it's just an outstanding film, like nothing you've ever really seen before, at least nothing like I've ever seen before. And in a year of big movies and franchises like the Marvel and Star Wars stuff, it's also really nice to see films like Knives Out and Joker and Jojo Rabbit and now Parasite, all films that are just so unique in their own right. Great to see them get recognized, and it's certainly great to see the editors behind them recognized as well. So knowing all that, you think I would jump at the chance to interview editor Jinmo Yang. Well, not so fast. One of the issues that gave me a little pause was the language barrier, but that in the end proved not to be a big deal. When I met Jinmo at the Eddies, it was obvious that his English was even better than mine. That said, the PR people for the film let me know that if we were going to do an interview, it would have to involve an interpreter. And I've done speaking engagements in Asia before with interpreters, and I knew firsthand that asking or answering a simple question can be a 10-minute process. But I decided to look at it as a challenge, especially when you consider the rambling, incoherent nature of a lot of my questions. Plus, it would force me to do something I need to do anyway, which is to slow down when I'm talking. So that'll explain why it sounds like I woke up from a nap right before I did this interview. And you'll hear Jinmo chime in English more than once in the interview. So in the end, I think the interpreter was probably just an unnecessary formality, but it all worked out nicely anyway. Now, the other issue I had to sort through when deciding to do the interview is something that I've never really come out and talked about on this podcast, and that is the fact that Jinmo did not use Avid to cut Parasite. He used the now defunct original Final Cut Pro. So of the 30 or so episodes of the rebooted Rough Cut that I've done, this is the first one where the editor did not use Avid. And there's a perception that this podcast is an Avid podcast, and that's understandable. I work for Avid. I host the podcast. Ergo, it's the Avid podcast. But it's not. It's my podcast. I pay for all the costs and the gear. I do all the work, which is obvious when you take into account the quality of this product. So there's no hard and fast rule that the guests we feature on the podcast use Avid. I'm sure that there are people listening patiently right now to me rambling that don't use Avid, and that's cool. The idea of the podcast, and even the idea of Avid itself, is to try not to exclude anybody. We can all get together and talk about editing and editors. Yes, I would be thrilled if you used Avid. And if you don't, all I ask is that you give it an honest try sometime. And of course, I had to ask Jinmo about Final Cut when I met him. He laughed and said that he always wanted to try Avid and was open to learning it. So I made it a personal goal to try and move him on from the original Final Cut. Speaking of the living dead, my other reason for wanting to interview Jinmo is that he cut one of my favorite movies, the South Korean zombie classic Train to Busan. And in a world full of zombie flicks and TV shows, Train to Busan is a truly great and truly original film, just like Parasite. And you know who else is truly great and truly original? Our guest today, Oscar-nominated editor Jinmo Yang. In the Skype, I ask really long questions. I'm going to try and do better about that.
That's fine.
Right now, the film is enjoying a tremendous wave of buzz and critical acclaim, and deservedly so. Has all of this been a little overwhelming for you, especially with your recent win at the Emmys?
모든 게 너무 놀랍다.
Yeah, everything has been overwhelming, and I still can't believe this is happening.
Well, the Oscars are coming up in a few weeks. Once again, you are nominated. What have you been doing to prepare for the big night?
사실 아무것도 안 하고 있고요.
Well, actually, I'm not preparing anything in special. However, I am trying to finish the edit that I'm working on before the Oscar.
No pressure. Well, Jinmo, often when people are describing a film, they will reference a combination of other films that have come before, but I really couldn't think of any movies that Parasite resembles, which is probably why it's been so well received by audiences all over the world. When director Bong first approached you with this film, did he have any other movies in mind that he related it to?
봉 감독님 영화.
Whenever I work with director Bong, we actually don't have a discussion about reference movie per se. However, I would say that Parasite is the epitome of director Bong's. When we look back at his filmography, his work has been come to this point, and I think cinematically this is sort of the top form. We can see that he is at the top of the game when we see the Parasite.
What was your first reaction upon reading the script?
뭐 감독님의 영화는 항상.
Whenever I received a screenplay from director Bong, I'm always anxious, and at the same time, I'm always very excited to read it because it's always turned out to be very great. And that was the case for this movie as well.
Parasite has the distinction of being nominated for both Best Foreign Language Film as well as Best Picture. I'm sure you wanted the film to be successful in every part of the world, but was there ever a decision or discussion between you and director Bong about making the film in a way that might appeal to Western audiences?
아니에요, 사실. 그냥.
No, whenever we go about making a movie, we don't go about it hoping that it will speak to the audience in the other side of the world besides Korea. It's not something that we sit down and talk about. We go about making the great movie as best as we can. And hopefully, with the anticipation that it will be seen by many people around the world, that has been our goal. We never sat down and talked about, we got to make this movie and collect the awards from all around the world.
Okay, so a similar question, and again, I apologize, it's a long one.
That's fine.
But there's a common belief that only action or horror or sci-fi movies from Hollywood will work well in foreign markets. Comedy and drama, because of the different languages, different cultures, they think wouldn't translate as well, would not be well received. But Parasite certainly proved that comedy and drama, when done expertly, works with Western audiences in North America and Europe. How do you think Parasite was able to overcome those differences in language and culture so well?
기생충 영화 자체가 되게.
Well, Parasite is, I think, a movie that's epitome of a cinema that everybody sort of agrees on. And it's a cinema that has overcome the barrier of the language. And on top of that, it's talking about the theme that anyone all over the world can relate to. And that has to do with how it's relating to people from all around the world.
So these days, it's not uncommon for editors to be working on location or even editing right on the set. You did this as well, but in a slightly different way with your assistant editor. Could you describe the process of how this worked?
한국
Because of the way the Korean film industry is sort of set up, not only the production, but post-production, it is required that we put out a great quality with the small budget we have. And essentially, most of the Korean production, they ask for on-set editors and they participate in the production as well. So it is, they ask for the on-set editors, and their job is to not only elevate the quality of the film, but on top of that, they are involved in various aspects of the filmmaking. Unlike America, where they have a more luxury to afford, not only budget-wise, but the time-wise, in Korea, we have to put out great quality of work in a short amount of time. I was on-set editor for Okja, and while we were shooting it, I was able to do the on-set editing, and in the continuance of the work, I was able to do the editorial afterwards. And that all had to do with putting out the better quality work in the post-production as well. But for the Parasite, I sent my assistant editor, who I had been working together for a long time. So they would be working on the set, and I will be receiving the footage, and I'll be putting out the assembly as I'll be receiving the footage real time.
So how does that unique workflow affect the dailies process? Are you seeing all the footage that's been shot? And does the director actually look at all the dailies with your assistant before it gets to you?
감독님은 현장에
Well, actually, Director Bong reviews the assembly at the production shooting set. So he would actually take the assembly after the shooting to his hotel, and he would review it, and he would sort of plan out the next scene. So he uses the on-set editing very effectively. To be honest, I don't think everyone is aware of this, but in Korea, there is no such thing as daily process. And I actually came about it for the very first time when I was working on Okja, because that was for the Netflix. And I was actually astounded by the process of daily, because that was the very first time. So I think my guess is that has to do with the fact that in Korea industry is geared toward the directors, unlike America, where more power is given to the producer and they have ultimately power over the cuts as well. But on the other hand, Korea is geared toward the director. So I feel like there is not necessarily the need for the dailies. As far as I'm concerned, I will be checking out the footage that we shot. Director will be checking the footage that he shot on the set. So I think that has to do with the reason why we don't have that daily process in Korea. And I think that also has to do with how the Parasite came about, because it's essentially very artistic cinema with a lot of freedom given to the auteur.
So speaking of that freedom, was there much or any improvisation by the actors, or did they stick very close to the script?
배우분들은
In a big picture, well, they will be bounded by the screenplay. However, as far as sort of small nuance, they would have sort of a freedom to improv here and there. And I think that's something that Director Bong, he respects the performers very much. So he will give that freedom. He would allow that.
Does Director Bong like to shoot a lot of takes, or is he able to get what he wants from his actors in just a few takes?
본 감독님은
So Director Bong is, if he gets what he sort of envisioned blocking wise and whatnot, he doesn't go too much or too small. I think he just goes about it just the right amount.
Once principal photography is over, do you and Director Bong work closely together? Is he with you in the editing room pretty much the entire time?
감독님이랑 저는 거의 맨날
Yes, I would say Director Bong and I are together for the duration of the editorial. Let's say we have decided to work on the edit for 3 months. Then for every day during that duration, except for the weekends, he and I will be together working on editing. So if he has some interview or something that he has to do that's unrelated to editorial, he would do it inside the editorial suite too.
Well, I'm glad he gives you the weekends off, though. That's good. Is working with him similar to other directors you've worked with in the past, or is your process a little different with him?
뭐 어떤 면에서는 비슷한
Well, some aspects are similar with the other directors, but there are some aspects that are different. But having worked with him for many years, I have become accustomed to how he works, the process that the director Bong goes about.
This is I believe, the third film, Okja, Snowpiercer, and now Parasite. Has that process changed any over those films, or has it remained pretty much the same?
뭐 거의 비슷해요.
I would say it was fairly similar compared to the other two projects. However, I would say, speaking of Parasite, because the other two films, they had dealing with the foreign language besides Korean, and it has to do there were a lot of CG. So besides the editorial concern, we had to also think about how to work with the foreign language, how to work with the VFX. However, for the Parasite, we didn't really have to go about concerning those aspects. So I was more comfortable, and we were more given a freedom to really go about editing, pure editing.
Okay, so I'd like to ask a little bit about the framing and the story, and I could be remembering this wrong, but it seemed to me that in scenes that feature the Kim family, the parasites, especially in their underground apartment, they were often all together in the frame, whereas the Parks, except for the very end, were rarely together. It was usually you would just see two of them, the husband and wife, the mother and a child, but I can't remember seeing them all together. Was this a decision that was made during production, or were there choices that you made during editing?
So all these processes were already written in the script.
Okay. A process many editors have to work through and sometimes don't like is audience test screenings. I remember you said you didn't make the film with Western audiences in mind, but did you have test screenings for both South Korean and Western audiences?
So Director Bong doesn't do test screening.
Oh.
he got the power. Yeah, and he has freedom.
Well, good. Okay, well, that I think everybody would like to have that power and freedom. Okay, so some editors like to spend time doing sound editing and design and really working with temp music and effects. Others like to focus on just cutting the picture and leaving the rest to the sound team. Jinmo, how would you describe your approach?
Well, I don't actually get involved in the final mixing stage because my editorial studio is far from the sound stage. And also, there's obviously the relationship between the sound supervisor and the director. However, on editorial stage, I would do anything that I can in regards to laying out the temp VFX effects, and also going about laying out the sound effects, laying out the reference music. So I would do whatever I can in order to cater to director. And also Director Bong is very hands-on, and he's very conscious about mixing and laying out all the effects at the editorial stage as well. And I think in today's age, especially, it's not only about putting together the picture, but also sort of laying out the guide reference for the CG effects, and also putting together the sound and music in the editorial stage. So one of the proud moment that I had was when Director Bong mentioned that when I come to the studio, it's like a one-stop studio that I can get an idea of how the CG is going to turn out, how the color correction is going to turn out, and how the sound mixing is going to turn out. Obviously, it's not going to be the final output because we have to go through another stage. However, and just having heard from director that I can pretty much give sort of an overall view of the outcome, that was most satisfying moment for me.
Oh, when you're good, you're good. I've read before that most of your attention during editorial is paid to the pacing of the film. Were there certain parts of the film that required more work or were harder to get right in terms of the pacing?
그쵸.
Yes, obviously, I'm very conscious about pacing, not for particular part, but I would say overall of the film. For the earlier part of the film is obviously compared to the other parts is it may feel lagging or long. However, we put in a lot of work. That actually we actually cut out. There was a scene that's taking place in the hair salon. We cut that out because we were aware of tightening the earlier part of the story. So it was all about making sure the audience understand where the story is going, understanding the characters in the movie, and I feel like we put in just right amount for the earlier part to work for the pacing. And obviously, working on the pacing is very challenging because director Bong doesn't do a lot of takes and he doesn't shoot coverages. And interestingly, he doesn't go about selecting the most perfect take. However, he would, for example, say, I like how Gi-taek performed in the first take. At the same time, I like how Gi will perform in the second take. Is there any way we can mix or combine it together? And whenever he throws that kind of comment, I would get a big headache. But at the same time, it is my challenge to sort of come and discover how to stitch together those two takes and present to the director. And that all has to do with putting out great pacing for the overall of the film.
That's a headache every editor has to deal with. So, and you sort of answered my next question, but I worked so hard on it, I'm going to ask it anyway.
Okay.
The setup of the film, as you said, is so much fun and contains much of the humor within the film. Just getting to know the Kim family and just seeing them making pizza boxes and stealing Wi-Fi signals, and it's so enjoyable to watch. But was it natural for you to want to let that play out longer, even though you know you need to keep things moving to get towards the darker parts of the movie's second half?
솔직히 말씀드리면
To be honest, that's the most we took out in order to work the pacing. You see them trying to look for the Wi-Fi. We see them trying to fold the pizza boxes. That's very ordinary things that we all can relate to. And I think every one of us has an experience trying to look for the Wi-Fi. So I think we left the most essence that sort of we can offer the audience to relate to the Kims. However, we put out anything as much as we can in order to pacing to work.
So the Kims, they're poor but resourceful and sneaky. The Parks are rich but sort of superficial. But honestly, the Kims are the ones that are the lawbreakers. The Parks never really do anything wrong, but we're still cheering for, if you can call it that, the Kims. Was Director Bong conscious of making sure that people understood that we relate to the Kims, but we understand that what they're doing is wrong, and that we don't like the Parks, but they're good people?
그러니까 그게 그냥
I think they turn out that way because of the predicament they are in. I wouldn't say the Kims are necessarily evil, but they turn out that way because of the situation they are thrown into. And I think the movie goes about showing how there are two sides to the human being. And I think that has to do with the fact that all of us are relating to the movie so well. And I would say that every one of us sort of roots for the underdogs. I think that's sort of human beings' natural tendency. So we would root for the Kims even though they are lawbreaker. We would say we would root for them, and we would root for them to come out of the semi-basement.
Okay, so even though, and I hope I get this right, but much of the movie is about distinguishing between the two families, how they're different. But I also noticed there were certain times where it looked like you were trying to show similarities. And what I'm thinking of is some insert shots. So in the beginning of the film, in the Kim's basement, you show very quickly an insert shot of some medals. And then later in the Parks house, same thing. There's a shot of Mr. Parks. I don't remember what it was, but it told you more about him as a younger man. Was that something, and I know you say that it's all in the script, but that seems like a very specific choice that you made to help draw a parallel.
영화 전체는 사실 그런
So overall in the film, there are a lot of devices that we sort of planted to show the symmetry of the two families. And especially when the Kims are infiltrating into Park's family, throughout the montage, you will see many moments that showing the parallel. When you see the medals in the Kim's family, their semi-basement, the medal that you see is of Mrs. Kim, Chung-suk's, and is to explain her character, how she is very strong woman physically, and because it's a medal that she got from, I forgot the word, but when for the track and field, they have throwing a ball, heavy ball for the track and field.
Shot put, yeah.
Yeah, she won that medal doing that. So it's more has to do with the reflecting the Korean society where a lot of fathers tend to become weak both mentally and physically compared to the mothers. And that is sort of a reflecting Chung-soo character with that moment that we shown with the medals to show her character as well as the dynamic between Chung-suk and Ki-taek, Mr. and Mrs. Kim.
So for an editor that likes to focus on pacing, there's no better kind of movie than Train to Busan. one of my favorite movies ever. This is a question that probably doesn't make sense in English, so I'm hoping that it translates better in Korean.
Okay.
But in zombie movies, you have two types of zombies. You have slow ones, you have fast ones. Usually they're slow. But in Train to Busan, not only are they fast, but for most of the movie, they're confined within the cars of a train. Did the combination of fast zombies and a small car make it more challenging to manage the timing and the space that should be between the characters?
브레이킹 배드가 아니었나 뭐였지 그게?
Walking Dead.
맞아, 워킹 데드 팬인데 워킹 데드도 그렇고
Not necessarily. Obviously, I worked on that film because I'm a fan of zombie films. And I would say I was more accustomed to faster zombie, per se. Having been a fan of Walking Dead, the World War Z. And not only me, but the director Yun, he also preferred faster zombie, and he didn't like slow, lagging zombie that much. So that has to do with the reason why, because we were more accustomed to the faster zombie, and also we liked zombie, and we would play zombie games as well.
How would you compare the experience of working on an action movie like Train to Busan to a comedy drama like Parasite?
사실은 한국에서 편집자로서 엄청
Well, as an editor working in Korean industry, I would sometimes work on 4 films in a year, but mostly over the past 5 years, I would work on 3 films in average per year. And during that duration, sometimes I get to cut spy films, sometimes I get to cut comedy, and obviously zombie film, action film like Train to Busan. And the thing is, I don't really go about making the movie aiming on one particular genre. And growing up, I would watch all kinds of film, all kinds of genre. So even if I switch from working on Train to Busan to Parasite, there wouldn't be much of awkwardness to switch the gear. However, in regards to Parasite, there's a montage with a lot of action, and there's a obviously comedic moment. So I would say it has everything in it.
좀비만 없죠.
Except for zombies.
Maybe in the sequel.
No sequel.
Well, speaking of sequels, most Train to Busan fans are aware that there's a sequel coming soon to that movie. Is there anything that much different in how you approach the sequel to Busan than for the first one?
좀 첫 번째는 이제
Well, whereas the first one, you were trapped inside the train, you felt very claustrophobic. The sequel is wide open, and it's not like the setting even is it's not like you're trapped in a small space. And obviously the scale of the action is much bigger, and is very dynamic. So it will be much more cinematic.
I don't think I've ever heard about how you really began your career in editing.
To be honest, my aspiration was to become a film director. So right around when I was about to graduate from college in the US, I actually worked on Todd Sloan's indie feature as a sound intern. And right after that, I got to meet a Korean film director who was at New York at the time trying to make a Hollywood film. But that didn't pan out. So he suggested that I come back to Korea with him. And being that I didn't have any experience as an assistant director, he suggested why not try as an on-set editor. That will look good on the paper, and you will be by my side getting to learn about the craft.
Well, it certainly looks good on paper now. Were there films or editors, either from Hollywood or in South Korean cinema, that influenced you?
사실 저는 코엔 형제
I'm a big fan of Cohen brothers, so I thought my sort of thinking was I could become an editor and director just like Cohen brothers. But actually, the biggest influence that had on me was watching films by Wong Kar-Wai.
Wong Kar-Wai, I guess. Wong Kar-Wai.
I admit I don't know him.
He made a movie called In the Mood for Love, and what else? Ashes of Time. Well, he's internationally very famous. Anyway.
Well, I better do my studying. I better brush up. So
it's spelled Wong, W-O-N-G, K-A-R-W-A-I. His most famous film is In the Mood for Love. Yeah. So picking up from where I left off, Jinmo had Wong Kar-Wai's films was the most influential films that he sort of made a decision to become a filmmaker. And afterwards, watching Tarantino's films sort of gave also sort of encouragement, because Tarantino afterwards began his career working at a video store. So I figured that I would have a chance to become a filmmaker myself.
What's your favorite Coen Brothers movie, Jinmo?
너무 많은데,
Too many,
사실.
but I would say Barton Fink.
Barton Fink. That sounds like the movie that the editor of Parasite would like. Okay.
No Country for Old Men.
No, that's good too. Raising Arizona is my favorite, but those are.
Oh yeah, me too. But yeah,
when you were at the,
there are so many.
There are so many. Did you meet Michael Miller, the editor of Raising Arizona, and I believe Miller's Crossing? He was at the Eddies, the nominee reception the other night.
Oh no, I didn't know.
If only I had known, I'd introduced you. Okay, so last question. This is the big one. If you had to move your edit suite into a basement with either the Kim family, who are funny but untrustworthy, or the polite but simple and boring Park family, who would you choose?
Kim family겠죠, 저는.
I would choose the Kims.
Yeah, I'd go with that too. Yeah, that was a bit of a weird question to go out on. I was probably pretty punchy by that point of the trip. Jinmo and certainly his amazing interpreter were incredibly gracious to do that interview with me. I hope he enjoyed it. He seemed to laugh after every question I asked him, so I hope that's a good sign. Or maybe there was a gas leak in his editing suite, who knows? Either way, I'm grateful that he took the time to talk to me. You know what? Avid has this nonlinear editor called Media Composer. And in that Media Composer is a feature called Script Sync. It lets you import a text file of your script and automatically sync it to your clips. You know what else? It supports a bunch of different languages besides English. One of them is Korean. So if you're working in Korean cinema and you want to make a big movie like Parasite, I think Media Composer and Script Sync would be a great help to you. So check it out right away. That's going to do it for this episode. So good to be back home in Boston, in the land of snow and sarcasm. We're a little light on the snow right now, but the sarcasm is in full effect. Wherever you are, have a great week. Do some editing. I will do some podcasting. Until we meet again, this is Matt Fury thanking you and Jinmo Yang for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.